My baby dolls. It's that time again. It's time for another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and we're not talking baseball today, but we are talking about boxing. And if you know your history of both baseball and boxing, they were the two major sports in the first half of the 20th century. Now, we got Gerald Gems coming back to the show for a third time, and it's always good when we have repeat performers coming back. That means they like the interview, they like the shows, and, you know, they're contributing to a part of sports history, which is definitely important, especially with boxing, because if you ask me about boxing has fallen off the rungs in about the last 20 years, and I'll get into that with Gerald. We'll find out what makes him interested in boxing, where boxing goes. But like I was speaking to Gerald before the podcast began, his book, which has been out for a few years, is called Boxing, A Concise History of the Sweet Science. And, of course, we'll get to understanding what the sweet science is, because it is mentioned in the book. But what really brings out the reason why you should go out and buy this book is because he goes back to ancient times, Greece and Rome and Africa and Asia, and we're going to find out how those cultures dealt with, the art of boxing. He dives into, which we'll talk about on another show, gender, race, social economics, getting into the modern age, television, how it affected. It's an overall view coming in from a lot of different angles. It's fantastically put together. As always, Gerald has done his homework and has a great note section and source section, bibliography sections to back up all his research that he did on this wonderfully put together book. We'll get to Gerald. We'll get to the book in just a second. Of course, you are listening to me on the Comfortably Radio Zone network, and the network's growing, folks. We got many shows coming this fall. My show, Genesis, returns. This is a special edition because I had to take time out, as most of you know, to raise my kids. I mean, they're going to be 10 years old this year, and I got to play camp counselor and daddy and cook and chef and take care of the household, and I just didn't have time. But I hope the summer's treating you folks well. We have had, since about June, we've had Nancy Finley, who is the niece of Charlie O., doing Oakland A's baseball with Ralph Tycho. We have a couple new shows coming in the fall, including Bill Kashadis on Philadelphia baseball, and that's going to be exciting. I'm in talks with Chicago sports writer and super attorney to sports people in the business, Eldon Ham, and I'm sure we're going to be hammering out something where he comes to do a podcast on both Cubs and White Sox baseball coming in the fall. You could see me also on Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia, where we have Sabre historian Alan Blumpkin, and we have renowned author David Nemec, and we take you each week back to a certain period of time. We started in the 1880s about 6 months ago, and we're going to conclude in 1968, and then we'll start doing other stuff like historical Negro League ball and women's ball and Victorian ball and the dead ball era, and we're going to go and we're going to try to educate you folks as much as possible. I also had the pleasure of being on Senators Baseball yesterday with George Case III, who was president of Sabre from about 1998 till about 2002. His father, of course, played for the old Washington Senators, and Glenn Case II, his dad, still holds the records on the old Washington Senators for stolen bases, and it's always a pleasure to talk with George and Ralph on Washington Senators, early Minnesota Twins baseball. We also had Jeffrey Sussman on the show earlier this year to talk about his new book about Jewish folks in boxing, and that was my big boxing show of the time. We spoke about Max Baer again. If many of you folks grew up in the 1960s, you'd know that his son was on the Beverly Hillbillies, and I wasn't around then. I wasn't born until 70, so I just read about these things and, of course, watched the show in syndication. But I illustrated with that show how boxing is very important. And even with the less publicity it gets today, it still is major money and major pay-per-view ratings, that brings in tons and tons of money. It was a sport that always brought in tons of money, and gamblers and men would have one fight, and they make a ton of money. And Gerald Gems has done a gem of a job putting this wonderful book together, and we're going to start talking about it as of now. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Gerald. How are you, sir?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you.
So what got you interested in boxing?
Well, my father was a boxer. He was an Army champion. We came from a working class family. It was the very first sport that he taught my brother and I, because he knew in the neighborhood we were going to have to fight growing up, and he was correct. But that was my initial introduction to boxing. But then, just as a sport historian, as a professor, it was one of the sports I was attracted to, simply because of, as you just mentioned in your introduction, the great importance that it had in American culture. As you said, it next to baseball, it was the next, and maybe in the 20s, perhaps even more popular than baseball. It was the first $1 million bouts came about that time. And just in terms of, as you alluded to, the ways in which a number of different racial and ethnic groups, you could trace their social mobility in the culture and in the society, through boxing, basically. Just looking at the different transition in ethnic champions from, the 19th century, the Irish, who were supplanted by the Jews, who were then supplanted by the Italians, and today, it's basically relegated to, black fighters and Hispanic fighters, who are still, for the most part, struggling. How a middle-class person or an upper-class person isn't going to choose boxing as a career. Okay, so this is where, socioeconomic status comes in, acceptance within society, all these types of things that I look at in the book.
Now, let me ask you this. You dedicate your book to your father, who passed away 12 years ago. He was a regimental boxing champion. What's that?
Well, in part of the training in the military service, part of it was fitness. Part of it was boxing is very much like bayonet training. I mean, the same techniques, the same strategies are used. And in fact, when boxing was outlawed in the earliest, actually in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it finally gains acceptability in World War I when they brought in professional boxers to teach the soldiers, and that correlated to bayonet training. And since that time, boxing was then adopted in the colleges until 1962, when it was, a college athlete was killed in a match, and that ended boxing along the colleges. But it was still used, for training and for fitness. As you stated in your introduction, the popularity of boxing was extremely high through the 1950s, maybe the 1960s, and then certainly resurrected with, or maintained with Muhammad Ali. And even in the 70s and 80s with, some of the great boxers like Sugar Ray Leonard and, Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns and people like that, Roberto Duran, still maintain a great popularity. I mean, it's dropped off since then. I think the younger generation is much more attracted to the mixed martial arts and things like that. Although, as you also stated, you see this big fight coming up with Conor McGregor, and the amounts of money that I think it's something like $300 million or something they're talking about. It's amazing the biggest fight still draw, as you said, huge pay-per-view audiences.
It's going to be huge, and you're talking about a mixed martial art champion versus a guy who's never lost before, Mayweather. So it's like, but is age going to play a factor into Mayweather? I don't know. Did it play a factor into Joe Louis when he did? No, because, again, he lost to Schmeling a couple of times, and he beat Schmeling with 37 seconds as his as his in the first round in 1937. But I think Joe Louis, if I'm not mistaken, he was the longest heavyweight champion we've ever had. I think his reign went for 12 years after that to 1949, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there's an interesting story behind that. Joe Louis pretty much had to continue fighting. What happened was, after, as you alluded to, the fights with Schmeling, he was, an American hero. And when World War II broke out, he was really considered too valuable to, throw into combat and a chance of getting killed. And so they made him a boxing instructor. And he traveled around the different, training camps, teaching boxing, but also putting on boxing exhibitions. And the money that he made in the exhibitions, he donated to the Orphans Fund for, children whose fathers had been killed in the war. But then after the war, the government then taxed him for all that money, and he couldn't pay it. So he had to continue fighting well beyond his prime, and it was kind of a sad story. He ends up, as a doorman in Las Vegas casino or hotel or something, and when he dies, it's actually Max Schmeling who has to pay for his funeral. So kind of a tragic story.
A lot of the boxers were not good with money management, Mike Tyson. I mean, how do you lose, $263 million,
Yeah, well, and as I said, boxers generally come out of the working class. They're not financially adept. They're not familiar with these types of things. They rely on and trust often their managers, who often swindle their money. They take enormous amounts right off the top, and guys don't, and again, you talk about, hundreds of $1 million, but, the fighters themselves may not see that. In fact, you've got, in New York, there's an association now that's organized to look after former boxers who are now destitute, on the street, homeless, which is not a typical situation for many of them. In fact, the research that's been done finds that very few of them, beyond the original ones I alluded to, the Irish and others who became managers and trainers, ended up in pretty much in working class positions that they started in. So there wasn't much social mobility for most of these guys.
Let me ask you this. What I found interesting always about boxing was how these guys can go on after taking, hit after hit. Now, Muhammad Ali ended up getting Parkinson's disease and most likely was attributed to his boxing career. But Ali stayed in too long, well into the early 80s. Why do you think boxers always think that they got that one last fight in them, and they go in, they make a spectacle of themselves, and it kind of tarnishes what they've done in the sport?
Yeah, well, I think, that's that, and I don't know that it's specific to boxers. I mean, you can look at the football players with Tom Brady at 40. He's going to go for several more years. Jay Cutler coming back out of retirement. Athletes think differently in terms of their physical prowess, in terms of their bodies. It's not till you get to a certain age where, your body definitely tells you that you can't do these things that your mind thinks you still can. And, part of it's pride, part of it, in a lot of cases, it's money, and part of it is identity. This is their complete identity is wrapped up in their physical prowess, and when they don't have anything else to fall back on, a lot of these guys go into depression. You see a lot of football players who've committed suicide and things like that with the CTE. And as you alluded to, almost every boxer ends up suffering from, brain damage. In fact, we mentioned my father a little bit. He was offered a professional contract by an agent in a bar. He looked down at the other end of the bar, which was kind of a hangout for boxers, and saw an old boxer drooling in his beer and decided that's not the career that he wanted to pursue.
Well, like you mentioned, it's the sweet science, but this is what you left out, of bruising. Now,
yes.
what's that about?
Yeah, that's been the title of a more recent book. The Sweet Science, actually the title was first used, as far as I know, by a British sports writer in 1926, but it was made more famous in the 1950s, I think, by A.J. Liebling, a famous sports writer who put out a book by the same name. And it's kind of became a catchphrase for boxing ever since. I mean, there's, as I alluded to in the book, there's a lot of people who are nominated for the Nobel Prize and other artists and other kinds of intellectual who really have a fascination with boxing, and a number of Joyce Carol Oates and a number of other writers have had Ernest Hemingway had a tremendous interest in boxing as kind of an art form. So for the working class, I mean, who's not normally associated with or even exposed to high culture in their lives for the most part, this is an art form. I mean, you can look at people like Muhammad Ali for sure, Sugar Ray Robinson, Sugar Ray Leonard, who are entertainers through boxing, who are more than just great fighters. And I just saw a fight the other night. What's his name? This Ukrainian guy. What's his name? Leftashenko or something like that. Who fights in a similar manner like Ray Robinson and Sugar Ray Leonard and Muhammad Ali, who is kind of the next big thing in boxing. They're all raving about him, but he puts on a quite a show, and he's really technically sound. I mean, it was a very impressive match against a guy who had been a former champion. He just destroyed him in 7 rounds.
Now, you know what's odd? I remember being 4 years old, and I remember the Rumble in the Jungle with Ali and George Foreman. And I remember they videotaped that. They shot all that, and it's been on. I watch it on YouTube how, Ali's playing to the cameras, and, they're asking him, hey, Ali, what does Ali Boombaye mean? He means Ali, kill him, And George Foster was a lot younger than Ali, and he was a lot taller, a lot quicker. Ali was about 32 years old at the time. Foster was, I think, 26, 27, Foreman was. He beat him in the jungle, but now 21 years later, at the age of 45, Foreman becomes champion. He builds his own empire, not only coming back in the late 80s when he was 40 years old, but also going through boxing and then capitalizing on a grilling machine, which I still have after 20 years. It's a fantastic product.
Yeah, and that just proves my point. I mean, he certainly didn't need the money. I mean, he was a millionaire on the barbecue grills that he was pushing, but he still identified, I think, as a boxer, and he had to come back and prove something to himself, if not other people. And as I said, that's often to the detriment of older athletes, boxers in particular. Archie Moore and others were others. I mean, when you look at these guys' records, and they had hundreds of fights, it's amazing that they lasted so long. But a rational person would say, why do you keep doing this at the age of 40? Or some of these guys even fought into their 50s. It was amazing. Roberto Duran was another one who I think had his last fight at 52 or something like that. But, a rational person would question their sanity.
Yeah, he was there a long time. Now, you go back. What's interesting? You go back, and there's evidence of boxing in Mesopotamia, which, again, if people don't know, it's Syria and Iraq. Boxing first appeared at 4000 BCE. I mean, that's just crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, well, you know what? I think in reality, we don't know how far boxing goes back. I'm sure, if there were historical records back as far as the cavemen, we could trace it back there. I'm sure guys fought over, hunting. Somebody killed a deer and the other guy was starving, or over women or whatever it might be. But, I'm sure physical combat was taking place from the beginning of time. It's just, where do we find the records? And so, as you said, I pointed some of these things in the book, some of the earliest records at least that I could find of instances of boxing. But when you look at some of the earliest civilizations that kept these records, like the Egyptians and others, it's pretty widespread.
And it's interesting because you mentioned the hieroglyphics on the wall with Egyptians and loincloths, duking it out. But now we get into ancient Greece. And again, Greece is the creator of the Olympics, and boxing, you were able to locate, was one of those events during those the 26th Olympics, I think, of ancient Greece. I forget which one it was, but anyway, you had boxing in the Olympics in ancient time.
Yeah, boxing, the first recorded one we have for the Olympic Games is 688 BCE. But again, when you think of the Greek civilization, it wasn't a united country like Greece is today. They were all, independent individual city-states that were always fighting each other, and so the Olympics represented a truce during these fights between the city-states, but, they're always engaged in combat. So boxing was part of warfare. You had to be proficient at it or you didn't survive. But then it becomes part of the Olympic Games, which are, really a religious festival as well. But there actually were 4 different games. The Olympics were the most famous, but there were 3 others, 2 of them, the Olympics, and another one dedicated to Zeus, the chief god, another one dedicated to another god, and then the women had their own games, which was dedicated to Zeus's wife, Hera. So, the Greeks were always competing, and boxing was just, as I said, kind of reflected their warlike culture.
And Sam, you bring up a good point because, this question is going to pertain to you personally. Again, the warlike culture in Greece, you had the Peloponnesian Wars and you had Sparta versus Athens, and you mentioned that boxing helped because it was, a sort of combat that can help you into warfare. You served in Vietnam, sir. How did boxing, not so much on technique, I mean, you still got to fire a gun. You're not going to go out like the Boxer Rebellion where you see people on the docks trying to box against, guns and stuff. But how did it give you the confidence to be? Now, were you in the Marines or the Army?
I was in the Marines, yeah.
You were right there. So
yes,
how did it give you the confidence? Everyone's scared on a battlefield, but did you feel more confident knowing that you've had these boxing skills taught by your dad?
Well, fortunately, I never used them, but I actually was in a battle where there was hand-to-hand combat. But if it came to that, yeah, you felt confident that you could prevail. And in actuality, there were times where, the fighting was so fierce you actually ran out of ammunition and you had a bayonet and your fist, and that's all that was left. So, my unit got wiped out a couple of times, so I'm lucky to be here.
And it's interesting because ancient Rome, again, when they conquered the Greeks, as we know in the, Greco-Roman architecture and art, the Romans borrowed heavily from the Greeks, and it seems that they borrowed heavily with boxing.
Yeah, they did, but the Romans were even more brutal about it. They had, they called them boxing gloves called the cestus, but what it was leather strips that they wrapped around their knuckles and up their forearms. But and the Greeks, I think, did this as well, but what the Romans did was they inserted glass in the leather strips and sometimes even spikes, and so commentators said this was more like a knife fight than what we would consider a boxing match. It was pretty brutal.
I could just imagine glass and gloves get punched in the face and half your face comes off. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this though. What the heck are funeral games? I read that and I'm like, what the hell's funeral game?
Yeah, funeral games was first recorded, as far as I know, in the Trojan War. Okay, and so this is the first, at least literary reference that I know of funeral games. So funeral games were, when a hero or somebody died, an important person died, just like the Olympics were offered up as a ritual honor to Zeus, the gods. They would also have funeral games that were offered up to these heroes who had died. And so the first mention that I'm aware of is in the Trojan War, where a hero is killed, and they offer up the funeral games in his honor. So that was, the story with Achilles and Patroclus and all these other Greek heroes that were involved in, the war that was supposedly fought over at the time, the world's most beautiful woman who was either kidnapped or seduced, the daughter of one of the Greek kings who was seduced or kidnapped, either way, by Paris, when the Trojan princes and brought back there, and the war went on for, until we get the Trojan horse story that it finally ended it after 10 years.
And then there was Halina of Troy. I think that was her name. And but still, you got even in Italy. You know, you mentioned here that males practice a form of sparring, which, as we know today, you see a guy with padded gloves and the other guy is boxing. You know, and they're wearing that equipment. But in Renaissance Florence, I mean, slap boxing or sparring was called civittino.
Yeah, there were actually, community festivals were held at least once a year, maybe more than once a year that I came across, especially in Venice and places like that where they had bridges where the different neighborhood groups, today we'd probably call them youth gangs, kind of contested with each other over who was going to control these bridges, and it was basically just a big brawl. Without weapons, but with their fists, and, people were not only getting knocked around, knocked off the bridges and into the water and things like that, but it was quite a spectacle for the rest of the community to watch.
Well, that was the thing. It was called War of the Fists, went into Venice, and you even wrote here, you see all these things like in the Lion, with the lion, like in Gladiator or any movie. You see the crowds going wonderful. There was no TV. I mean, this is where you went. You went to go see someone get chewed up by a lion or a boxing match where you're beating the hell out of it. That was the form of entertainment, which a lot like gambling. Maybe there was gambling going on. It took a personal matter when you're gambling your own money to get a winner. The War of the Fist. Listen to what you wrote. The tussles resulted in injuries, dunkings, and occasional deaths for the amusement of spectators. Huge. Huge. I mean, when I'm reading that, you just can't casually read that and just go on to the next sentence. You're like, what the heck were these people, barbaric? And then you got to say to yourself, well, how much do people pay to go to a regular boxing match? And when their blood is drawn, they all scream, I mean, have we really changed from the ancient times? No.
No, I think there's something primal there, that some of the instinctual remnants, I think, that are still in many humans. I think, society tries to cultivate some of those things out of us into higher standards of deportment. And there's a whole book about this called The Civilizing Process. But again, you've got different, what I refer to in the book, especially in the section on, social groups and things, social class, is a term called habitus, and it's really about, basically the simple kind of formulation of the term, it's a French term, is that based on the social class in which you grow up is going to affect your worldview, the way that you see the world, the way you perceive it. So people in the working class who don't have a lot of money, who may not have much education, what's most important to them, and really the only thing that they have, is their body. Their physical prowess is important. So you see many of the professional athletes who come out of the working class, especially in combat sports like boxing or perhaps football. This is how they identify. This is how they see the world. And even, when you mentioned Tyson, Tyson's a good example. The guy goes through $250 million, and on what? How many cars can you buy? How many can you drive at one time? Or a huge house that you can't possibly live in all those rooms. Things that provide some idea of what they consider social status, right? But it still all relies on their own physical prowess. And once that's gone, you lose your identity as well.
And you know what struck me also, Gerald? You see, you got to read these things carefully. This process in Rome went on for about 2,000 years. It wasn't outlawed until 1705.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, in Rome, the guys that were the gladiators were basically slaves, or people captured in war. But, they were kind of sex symbols to even aristocratic women. So you had a few guys who volunteered to be gladiators. But for the most part, they were expendable bodies, and part of this was very political. These gladiatorial games and the contests, chariot races, and all this type of stuff that was conducted in the Hippodrome and then also in the Colosseum where the gladiator games took place were paid for by the wealthy people, by the patricians, the people who were the politicians, and the purpose was for what was called social control. They wanted to keep these people entertained, okay? If you kept them entertained, they wouldn't think about their plights in life or how things were bad or if they were upset with some politician. And so these were weekly events. I mean, they had chariot teams from different neighborhoods in the city, just like we have baseball teams today. And you could say that this still has an effect on people today. You've got a lot of people who might not be concerned about the political situation because they're checking their ESPN app to see what their favorite team's doing, or they're watching the ball game. They're concerned about their, local team, which really doesn't have a great effect on their life, other than maybe temporary emotional investment. But other things that are much more important, they don't give as much thought to until they actually really have to, lose a job or something like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. All this stuff is emotional, especially if you don't wager. And that's another story in itself, the gambling aspect, but we won't get into that yet. But I'll tell you what we are going to get into. We're going to get into Africa. Now, let me ask you this about, I think I'm pronouncing it right, the Dambe fighters or Dambe fighters. Did Africa borrow boxing from the Romans?
Well, there was a trade. The trade networks are pretty extensive. So whether or not they did, I don't know for sure. I suspect, as I said, that these things are just going to evolve naturally through combat between men for whatever reasons. As I said, fighting over food or over territory, or over women, what they're fighting over, right? And each of them kind of evolve in their own forms based on their particular culture or the society that they grow out of. And so you had some particular differences and rules and things like that in different cultures in different areas. For example, in Asia, they use their feet, the Muay Thai, the Thai boxers, and it's evolved into the mixed martial arts that you see on TV today. But different locations evolved kind of different forms of boxing, and Dambe was one of those. Oftentimes they were a part of it was a courting ritual where they would put on these fights hoping to impress young women that they might then marry down the line or things like that. But even the Dambe had particular rules. The bouts lasted for 3 rounds until somebody was knocked down. And that kind of mirrors some of the early British rules in boxing, where a round wasn't timed. Initially, it was counted when somebody was actually knocked down. So a round could go for several minutes, or the way this evolved was guys who would tire would simply kneel down and take a knee, just for a rest. And so eventually you get rules that evolve into timed rounds and what's considered a knockdown and things like that. And once you knock the guy down, this lasted until the 20th century. You could just simply stand over him, and as soon as he got up, punch him again. And you first see that with the Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney fight, where Dempsey loses a fight because he didn't go back to the corner in time when he knocked Tunney down, and so it ends up being 14 seconds that Tunney gets to recover when the fight should have been over under the old rules. So. These things continually evolve, and you see it in all sports. The rules changes and the regulations as society changes, and just like today with baseball, you're big on baseball. Now, people are discontented with the length of games, and so now they got 20, 30 seconds in between pitches. And they got to throw the ball. So, these rules continue to evolve over time. With there's all kinds of reasons for that. Technology is certainly one of them.
Now, this is interesting. In South Africa, you had something that was in the bare knuckle form, which again it takes like the 19th century form of boxing that some of us are familiar with when reading the history of boxing. But here you have an organized boxing in South Africa where you start at age 9 and everybody's linked by pretty much age group here.
Yeah, you can trace this all the way back to the ancient Greek Olympics as well. They didn't chronologically figure age among the Greeks, but the way they differentiated between boys' events and men's events was once you acquired facial hair, you were considered to be a man, and then you had to step up and compete with other men. Other than that, you were allowed to compete among the boys. Certainly, this incident you just brought up in South Africa was many years later, after the Greek Olympics, but by this time you've got all kinds of ways of chronologically figuring people's age, so it was probably somewhat more specific by that time.
And some of the things that came out of this in South Africa was female spectators were not permitted, but one former champion described it in a very psychological way. And listen to this. Fighting here keeps the young men away from crime. It also teaches them not to beat their women. They must be men to fight other men. That's like reverse psychology on a brutal sport.
Yeah, but I think, you still see vestiges of that today. And so even in the inner city, where kids grow up tough, they have to fight. You've got guys who are never going to reach, television or be contenders. But the fact that they are boxers, athletes in general get respect because of their physical prowess, in neighborhoods where, there's a lot of gang problems and things. But a boxer himself is going to get respect, and kids will carry their bags to the gym and things like this because, first of all, it's another form of social control. A boxer has to stay in shape all the time. They're in the gym boxing. It keeps them off the street, keeps them out of trouble. They have to be disciplined if they're going to be any good at the sport at all. And again, there's always this hope that you can move up, that you can make money at the sport that you can't make someplace else. And again, it's about masculinity, it's about propriety, okay? And in almost any culture, if a man beats a woman, that doesn't show his physical prowess. Everybody's looked down upon for something like that. If you fight another man, anytime you step in a ring, any boxer is putting his life on the line. It's documented, hundreds of times about people who have been killed in boxing matches. It's possible to lose your life simply by getting in the ring. And so there's an element of courage there that any boxer publicly displays. And I think that's an important part of the equation. In terms of masculinity, men have to display their physical prowess to other men. If I go out there and, jump 7 feet, high jump, and nobody sees it, who cares? Nobody's going to believe it unless it's actually publicly performed and it's seen by other people, and you establish your masculinity and your physical prowess in front of other men. That's part of the equation that's necessary. And
you are right. When just talking to you and hearing your answers, there is a science about it. It on the surface, it looks brutal. It's always been labeled a brutal sport. You can die from it, but there is a science to it. And part of the science we spoke earlier about was the military. But here we are in China and the Han Dynasty, and you have military training. It's called the combat of the two hands. What's that about?
Well, the combat of the two hands refers to what we would call boxing, right? Taught as martial arts have a long history in Asian cultures, and so this one can be traced back, at least about 800 years already, right? And involve boxing gloves. Okay, so I've got to go to China in November, and a lot of things that Westerners claim as the pioneers of things like soccer and polo and things like that were being played in China many centuries before the West thought they invented these things. And so here's another case with boxers adopting gloves, right? And being taught. This is as part of their martial training as soldiers, right? And even a book written about it that's entitled The Combat of the Two Hands.
Yeah, and it's amazing because the sport didn't do well in China as it would other. It was pretty much in disuse, and it was brought up in the 1920s, and this was shocking to me, by Christian missionaries. For God's sakes, you're passing around the love of Jesus, and now you're introducing this brutal sport that you can die from it?
Yeah. Well, again, this is part of masculinity, but it also during the 19th century, you've got this division in boxing where the middle and upper classes try to outlaw it and ban it, especially because of, as you mentioned before, the gambling aspect of it, which they saw as immoral. But it was only immoral for the lower class to gamble and engage in these activities because supposedly they didn't have enough money to gamble and their family would suffer if they lost their money. Those who had disposable income, the middle and upper classes, it was okay for them to gamble. But they also, to prove their masculinity, engaged in what we would call boxing today, but they had other terms for it in terms of they would spar. So even Teddy Roosevelt, as president, had a professional boxer who was his tutor. He would spar with General Leonard Wood. I think Wood knocked him out at one point. But among more established men of the upper classes, this was considered proper training in terms of masculinity. But when it came to actually engaging in a fight for monetary purposes or gambling, was considered below them. Right? This is what the working class did, and so there were, as I said, there were regulations against boxing until New York about 1911, 1912 finally figures out, well, we can't ban it. They're going to do it anyway. The way that they were getting around it was they simply would form a clandestine bout in any place. It could be, in a garage or wherever it might be, and they would call it a club, and you paid 50 cents, whatever the price was, to enter the club and become a member. That was your dues. And then they simply called the boxing match an exhibition. Okay, so it was an exhibition of the manly art of self-defense. This is how the middle class termed it. The working class simply called it boxing. And as long as they didn't have a decision, it wasn't technically against the law, but simply the way that they settled bets was simply the next day the sports writers would declare who they thought the winner was, and this is how bets were then paid off. So there were ways to circumvent this. So New York realized, well, you can't outlaw this. It's been going on for thousands of years. And so what they did is they formed a state commission in which they could license it and also tax it, and so they could make money out of it. And this is how boxing eventually, and as well as I mentioned before, the World War I aspects of military training and fitness, how it becomes legitimate. And so you start getting million-dollar bouts by the 1920s already, and this is when it really takes off in terms of popularity.
No wonder why they put it in Vegas. There's no state tax on anything.
Yep. In fact, Vegas from the earliest days, before it was a state, was the only place where boxing was legal, and that's why the biggest fight in the early 20th century, the Jack Johnson fight and Jim Jeffries fight, took place in Reno, Nevada, because no other state would allow it. San Francisco initially was going to host the fight, and then the governor overruled the promoter and said you couldn't do that, and so they transferred it to the middle of the desert in Reno. It was a little town at that point, but people came from all over the world to see this fight.
And you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. He was a very sickly child, and of course, he was very nearsighted, and he was thin as a rail. I mean, he was, at one point, I think they thought he was going to die as a kid. He was underweight. He was sick in hospitals, and again, coming from a prominent New York family, he went to the gym. He twirled clubs, he did gymnastics, and he boxed. And the boxing, I know he admitted, brought on his masculinity, which he shared with his children. All his boys were learned in the boxing method because he thought not only should you be good in studies, but you should be rigorous in exercise as a man. And boxing was one way, as well as war. Was another way to show your masculinity.
Yeah, he was a big proponent of football as in promoting martial spirit. But he also went out west for a couple of years. As you said, he had a terrible physical condition. He went out there to build himself up, to breathe the clean air. And he was really proud of a story that he relates in his autobiography, about his couple years as a cowboy and how he apparently had this high shrill voice, and a cowboy in a saloon had insulted him, and how he knocked the guy out. And he was very specific about this story and wanted to make sure that people knew about it because it was a measure of his masculinity. So as I said, even upper class men, even though most of them social status is gauged through wealth, or other similar means, still almost any man, and the psychologists have referred to this, have to have some element of physical ability in some way to gain the respect of other men.
And with the same Roosevelt story, when he knocked that guy out, a lot of people don't know, the guy called him Four Eyes because of his glasses he was wearing.
Yeah.
The standard, glasses without rims and stuff. Well, it had rims, but not the hold. They were not Nez Pence. Were they Nez Pence? Maybe. I don't know. They were Nez Pences. So what he did, Roosevelt, he knocked the guy out, and he made sure to take his guns away so he wouldn't have to retaliate.
Yeah.
So,
well, he was a smart guy.
When in the Spanish-American War, what's funny, because I love talking about Roosevelt, both Roosevelts. He claimed that the Battle of San Juan Hill was the greatest battle since, going back to Waterloo and stuff like that earlier in the 1800s. But you know how he won that battle? First of all, the Spanish were on the hill, and now you got this guy with eyeglasses stapled to most of his body, his whole uniform, and he had a high-pitched voice, Roosevelt, and he told them to charge up the mountain. They thought he was nuts, but they ran away. That's how the battle was won.
Yeah, it wasn't, as you said, it wasn't quite the big victory that it was portrayed in books and by writers. And another incident involved the way that the black soldiers, who had actually charged up the hill before the Rough Riders and were coming back for more ammunition and water, were characterized as cowards, as running away from the battle, when in fact they had already had some success and were coming back for more, supplies. When Roosevelt makes his charge up the hill. And so they're characterized as cowards, whereas Roosevelt and his Rough Riders come out as big heroes.
Yeah, man, it's just amazing what the victors of war always embellish or fabricate history. Another example of that was Operation Market Garden. Not a lot of people knew about that until, Cornelius Ryan wrote about it in the late 60s, and of course you had the movie with Robert Redford. And
was that Saving Private Ryan?
No. In 1977, what was it called? A Bridge Too Far. And,
okay, yeah. Okay.
A Bridge Too Far. We didn't know about it. Montgomery hit it because, and it wasn't until the World at War series with Sir Jeremy Isaacs that came out in 1973 that they first speak about it. And they spoke about it because Vietnam was going on, and we weren't, winning the war. We were pulling out of the war, and so this came out, and it was highlighted that, Montgomery always said it was a successful failure. No, it was a failure. We dropped 35,000 men behind the German lines and able to secure 7 bridges and trying to get the 30th Corps, which was a tank corps made up of the British. The paratroopers would drop behind German lines, and the tanks would roll right through and seize upon the bridges, the paratroopers would do, until the tank brigades came, saved the bridges from being blown up so they could cross the Rhine River. But it didn't work. It failed, and there was a lot of casualties which were not known because the Allied brass kept it from the public. And
yeah, they covered a lot of those things up. I read a book recently about D-Day, which was quite similar, about all the paratroopers that were dropped behind the lines, but and in many cases they were pretty much sacrificed. There wasn't a lot of success there either.
And you read about these things, and And, it's like, wow, we distorted history so much. I'd say about 80% of it's true, but the 20%, hey, that's embarrassing. Now we got a form of boxing called, is it Muay Thai or Muay Thai? I don't know what the hell.
Muay Thai, yeah, that's it's the prominent form in Thailand, which is I think where it started. Thailand and Cambodia both claim that they started it, but it's still quite popular in Thailand today. But you can see how what we turned into mixed martial arts came out of kind of this original form of the sport, where it was acceptable to use your feet as well as your hands, right? And it's pretty amazing what some of these guys can do with their feet and the kind of force that they can generate from a kick, perhaps much greater than a fist. But this is where it started, yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? It was real popular. That it only didn't, stay in Thailand and Cambodia, but it went, I think, to the Philippines as well. And in addition, you had gambling running rampant on this sport as well.
Well, gambling is really big in Asia. I probably in probably in all cultures, but it's extremely big, especially in China. In fact, China is trying to, like we have Las Vegas, they have Hong Kong and, a couple of other specific places where they have casinos, and they are trying now to attract some of the biggest boxing matches to these locations because of the gambling aspect, and especially in the lower weight classes, many of the top contenders are Asian fighters. And so, they're trying to bring some of the bigger matches over there as well, but they do attract quite a bit of attention and host a lot of these big matches in those locations over there because of the gambling aspect.
And it's even right here, King Rama VI even awarded military titles to the best boxers by the early 20th century. That's like, wow, you're getting a military honor for being a boxer. Yeah.
Well, later, even, before this, the British noblemen, when they're traipsing around in their coaches, would hire tough guys they were called footmen, but their job was basically to run ahead of the coaches and clear the way so they could make good time on the roadways. Well, sometimes, local people got pushed around. They ended up fighting. One of the stories I had in the book was about a butcher who then beats up one of these footmen, and then you get bouts generated out of this with local people fighting these footmen, and the nobility betting huge amounts of money on these bouts. In fact, one of them lost an amazing amount of money. The story's in the book, and they end up trying to shut down boxing for a while because of this, but obviously were not successful. But this is another way in which boxing just erupts out of normal everyday life and creates local heroes as well.
And and you mentioned the Asians really like to gamble, and I go to over here on the East Coast we got Atlantic City, and we got Foxwood, which is about an hour from my house on Mohegan Sun. In Connecticut, it's about an hour and a half. But when you go to these places, I don't like to stereotype people. You see a lot of Asians at the gambling places. But I'll tell you my first recollection of noticing that gambling from Asia was prevalent. It wasn't until you remember the movie The Deer Hunter?
Oh yeah.
With Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken. I think that was Meryl Streep's first thing. They were captured and put into bamboo cages. I forgot the third act. Well, anyway, after they're gambling on Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and the other guy playing Russian roulette to see which one's going to blow their head off and stuff. And a cabbage full of money's going right in there on the table, and that And I was maybe about, I'd say, early 13, because the movie came out in 78, I believe, and I didn't see it until I got to TV. I wasn't allowed in the movie theaters at 8 years old. But that just, like, struck me, saying they did that in Vietnam. They gambled on POWs blowing their heads off and stuff like that, playing Russian roulette. So that earliest instance of seeing that in the movie, fixated. I always think about it when I go into a casino, and I never gamble. My wife likes to sometimes do that, my in-laws. And I see the Asians, I always go back to that scene in The Deer Hunter. It just jogs my memory.
Well, for many people, life is a gamble. Again, we go back when we talked about the working class. I mean, they're the people that are most affected by economic turns and things like this. And so life for them is a gamble. They're willing to step in a boxing ring to make a few bucks and things like this. I told you my father was a boxer. My uncle, my maternal uncle, my father didn't have any brothers, was a club fighter. And he tells me, he's 95 years old today, and he tells me stories about how he'd get in the ring, on whether a weekly basis, whatever, just to make $2 or $3 or whatever they could make during the Depression, things like that.
Well, money was so scarce, yeah. I mean, the statistics said a quarter of the population wasn't working. I think it's more than 50%, if you ask me. Maybe even more because of the stats they didn't have for the poor and all the folks out in the Dust Bowl where the crops, if you add insult to injury, your crop, you're not selling your crop, now the whole thing is destroyed. So it was a pretty terrible time in the 1930s in boxing. Max Baer and a couple of others, made their living that way, and people who had the means to go to Yankee Stadium and see these things and put the money on the table. I mean, for, an hour or two of boxing and 12 rings, 12 rounds back then, not 16, you're making a whole year's money, or maybe 3 years worth of money by fighting for like an hour or so.
Yeah. When you consider that, I mean, that was like winning the lottery for somebody back then, and so they were willing to take that chance.
And even the losers come out with a nice pot. So it's just their reputations are tarnished. Next time we have you on the show, we're going to get into the evolution of boxing. My goals were satisfied today, talking about the ancients and setting us up for the next round of chapters in the book, because I think now we're going to be talking about more formalistic style of boxing, which emanated, like you mentioned in your book, in the early 1800s in England and, leaped over to America. And then we got to get into races and gender and religion and how boxing, shaped the American culture, especially with Howard Cosell. Because I remember that, watching it on Wide World of Sports every week. I mean, I remember, Ali and Frazier and stuff like that, and the whole battles Cosell had with Ali and stuff. And to me, that's the only age of boxing I saw. I mean, I stopped watching boxing after Lennox Lewis became champion. But when I grew older, and speaking to guys like yourself and others who have written about the sport, who have purchased the Ring magazine for over the years, the golden age of boxing really was in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
You could see it was a lifestyle that not only men clung to, but women clung to. It was like a live movie when you think about it, like a Broadway show. Except now you have a
in fact, when you talk about a Broadway show, most people don't even know there were female boxers who actually started as vaudeville stars in the late 19th century. They put on boxing shows and became quite famous, even claiming world championships and things like that. So that's another aspect of the story maybe we can get into sometime.
Yeah, we're going to get into it next time. I'll have you on either in September or October. I hope you had a good time today. I always enjoy speaking with you, Gerald. Your books are very, very well written and well researched. And I learned a lot, and I'm sure my listeners who had written to me on the shows before, Jackie Robinson, as we explored different types of sports, including boxing. I think we spoke about Jack Johnson last time. In addition to barnstorming airplanes and track and all this other stuff, there is a place for boxing in the history of sports, and you do a heck of a job of putting it together in the book. And that's why we're going to be back for another 2 rounds with you to explore more about the sweet science of bruising, nevertheless.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Of nevertheless. So hold the line. This is how I end it, as I always say, folks. I had a great time with Gerald, and when you get into the art of boxing, if you want to call it an art, it's like baseball. It's a thinking man's sport. It's just not going out there and getting your head knocked off. There is a combat training aspect to it, which Gerald alluded to, that was picked up in the military, used by the military. Boxing was a way of instilling confidence in a lot of young men. It is indeed probably the most masculine sport on the planet still, and we have the the United Fighting Championship, and the mixed martial arts have taken it over, and that's getting a lot of publicity. But again, to understand boxing is also to understand world culture, as we've seen today, not only American culture, but Asia, Africa, and Europe, and the ancients of Greece and Roman times, and even into the Middle East with Mesopotamia. We've just documented, and to me, it's very fascinating. Go out, get this book. It's called Boxing: A Concise History of the Sweet Science. Where can we find it, Gerald?
Well, you can order it probably through any bookstore, but it's readily available on Amazon as well.
And it's just one of those books which I think you should have on the bookshelf. I have mine on the bookshelf. For God's sakes, Gerald autographed it for me, signed the book. I'm not going to get rid of that book. So, besides being a good book, it's been, he wrote it to me, and having him on the show has just been great. And, on behalf of Gerald Gems, I'm Ian Kahanowitz, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.